When someone with the authority of a teacher, say, describes the world and you're not in it, there's a moment of psychic disequilibrium, as if you looked in a mirror and saw nothing. Adrienne Rich, Blood, Bread, and Poetry, Selected Prose. If you're a fan of video essayists like PhilosophyTube or HBomberGuy or D&D YouTubers like Matt Colville or The Dungeon Dudes or How to Be a Great GM, you may have noticed that they don't look like me. When I started this channel, it was partly because of this tweet. I remember looking through the responses and realizing that most of the people listed were Twitch streamers and not primarily YouTube creators. I got really disappointed. Part of why this channel exists is just that. When someone says online that representation matters, or that they're looking for diverse folks making content, the common refrain is, who cares what race they are as long as they make good content? It's kind of a hot button issue. But is it all that matters? Does representation actually matter? Why did the fantasy geekdom get so up in arms about black elves and dwarves?
Since wokeness!
I want to come at this from both an objective and subjective angle. Let's confront the history, the experience, and the science of representation. Remember when you were a kid, playing pretend, maybe with a friend? Maybe you were superheroes or astronauts. I remember playing pretend, trying to imagine myself as a character in a movie. As a kid, you soak up that stuff. Media is how we pick up on a lot of information. We think a lot about that in the sense of advertising, political media, or even propaganda. But it's more in-depth than that. Media that has no intent to provide a message can still affect us, both on a macro and societal level, and on a micro or individual level. I could just point to the recent controversy surrounding critical race theory. How you respond to those three words tells me a lot about where you get your news. You can say that it's teaching an anti-white American agenda. Or you can say it's simply teaching history with an eye towards racial conflict in the United States. Either way, you'd be wrong. As an attorney who's actually read some of the foundational texts of CRT, this is a legal theory, by the way, it seems weird that there's even a controversy or discussion right now. That's the media's influence over you. It's more than just confirmation bias. It'll tell you how to think about something when your biases have no bearing on the topic at hand. But it's also about what you're exposed to, what experiences you have, what education you have. Using the CRT example again, being both an attorney and a person of color, I have experiences that will influence how I view it. But what does this have to do with representation in the media? Well, to me, all media is the art of telling stories. We've been doing that through various methods, from cave painting to multimedia projects to dice and paper around a table. What stories we tell and how we tell these stories affect the people who consume this media. And the biggest obstacle for the understanding of this is denial. People discuss this apparently new trend of putting people of color into stories that primarily involve white people. This forced diversity of the modern age is usually decried. On one side, people are angry because these stories never had people of color in them. They are stories told by Europeans or by those of European ancestry, and it is unrealistic to have these people in those stories as they never existed in that time and were not part of the stories or myths of those cultures. Except, they were. Now, the history of POC in Europe, we've already gone over. But POC also appeared in their stories. One of the older examples I love to put in here is Balthazar, one of the three magi seen in depictions of the birth of Jesus. Now, why I place this example here in reference to these stories is that European artists started a tradition of making Balthazar a black African magi. Biblically, there's no definite number of magi at the Nativity, and they're only described as being from the East. So the idea of one of them being from Ethiopia is a pure invention of Western tradition. Most think that number 3 comes from the 3 different gifts that were mentioned, while everyone at the Nativity would probably be considered POC by today's standards. I always find it funny how many people will gloss over the fact that Christianity is a Middle Eastern religion. It didn't originate in Europe. This is interesting that European artists and interpretations would discuss one of them as especially being black African. Prester John is another figure of myth and story, a legendary Persian, or Indian, or Ethiopian king of a lost Christian kingdom. Some stories tell that he was the descendant of one of the 3 magi. Merchants and ambassadors were sent to investigate this mythic character. Even Pope Alexander III sent a letter to Prester John, but there's no evidence that this person or his kingdom ever existed. Just a made-up notion from Europeans of a random Eastern Christian monarch helping them out around the time of the Crusades. But as folks commented on my last video, there's a treasure trove of POC in Western media, and it's from Arthurian legend. In the story of Sir Parzival from Wolfram von Eschenbach's epic poem Parzival, it is told Parzival's half-brother Fierifis is mixed race. Yay! Being of both Angevin or English descent through his father and black African descent from his mother, Queen Belkane. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Clearly this guy is just a knight with black armor. It's a common motif of the age. However, the text of the poem disagrees. His mother is described as having skin as black as night. Fierifis is described as having skin like a magpie. This is a weird medieval misconception of what would happen if people were born of mixed descent. Clearly it's not the case. I wonder if these folks in medieval taverns would, debate the skin color like we do today. Verily he donned the umbral armor. He is not dark of skin. Looketh well upon this visage, learned scholar, and tell me this knight is without a bronzed countenance. Clearly thou art a gospeller of that correctness politique, a purveyor of that so modern of philosophies, wokeness. Little known fact, 13th century Twitter actually used carrier pigeons. It just took long to retweet because of all the little drawings in the margins. Then there's the story of Sir Morian. He's the brother of Percival, who's born of an English father and a Moorish mother. Wait, this was from the Middle Dutch Lancelot Compliance. Okay, Europeans just find a trope and they go with it. Now, he's described as being, quote, all black, even as I tell ye. His head, his body, and his hands were all black, saving only his teeth. His shield and his armor were even those of a Moor, and black as a raven. Now, this portrayal of Morian is a bit problematic by modern standards. He's described as being uncouth and aggressive. Kathy Darrop writes, Morian's blackness, like his aggressive behavior and menacing speech, is fearsome to the other characters. He is perceived as bestial and violent, a sexual, aggressive, pugnacious savage on one hand, and a delicate, fragile, exotic oriental on the other. There is Sir Priamus, the Saracen, who converts to Christianity and becomes a knight of Camelot. Sir Gawain and the Turk, which is basically the same story as Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, except the Green Knight is Turkish. These characters appeared in Le Morte d'Arthur, which was published in 1485 by Thomas Malory. Of the characters I just described, the ones from Malory's are actually the most recent. The characters showed up between the 13th and the 15th centuries. These are not additions made by T.H. White and the Once and Future King. In fact, T.H. White erased the POC backgrounds of some of the characters and eliminated other characters in full. In the case of Arthurian legend, removing POC characters from the story is the more modern revisionist history, and not true to the older text. And to be honest, there are more all over history. I'm sure there's some knowledgeable folks that will cite more characters in the comments below. I've had to leave out a few just so that we don't linger too long on this. And that was it. That was what the original version of the video was going to be. When I started working on this project, my goal was to point out POC in European history and European stories. But I realized that that wasn't enough. Because while we have established that POC characters have always existed in medieval fantasy stories, and that their erasure is more modern and a betrayal of the original stories, there's more to representation than just showing that it happened in the past. Many folks commented on my prior video, and in so many Reddit posts, and Twitter threads, and YouTube comment sections about how they think representation doesn't matter. So let's look at that. Let's look at the evidence of it. Let's take a moment to discard our preconceptions and actually take a look. Part 2. We will be seen as we should be seen every day. Martin Luther King Jr. So there was this moment where my spouse and I were watching the pilot episode of the Disney animated show The Owl House, where the main character's mother says,
"And what were you going to do with this?"
That was for the Act 3 closer.
Mija, I love your creativity, but it's gotten out of hand.
And I looked over, and my spouse's eyes lit up as she said to me, "Wait, she's a nerdy, bookish Latina? She's me." She is a grown, successful, and confident woman. She's incredibly capable and deals with pressures and stress throughout the day that most people can't even comprehend. She is not the image of some delicate snowflake that folks try to create when discussing folks who appreciate this sort of thing. You know, when I was a kid, I wanted to be an actor. But I looked at the landscape of what the entertainment field looked like for a darker-skinned East Asian-looking actor in the 90s, and I came to the conclusion that there was no way I would get a chance to be successful. So that dream of mine went away. And you can say that I made a common choice. Tons of people decide not to try their hand at Hollywood because of the volatile nature of that profession. And you'd be correct. I'm not saying that this was the only contributing factor to the decision. However, I know my own thought process and how I made that decision. So you can't say that it wasn't a factor either, because I know for a fact it was. In fact, there are a ton of stories that can show the powerful effect that representation can have on people. Star Trek is a great example of this. Nichelle Nichols was cast in the original series of Star Trek, a show that displayed a utopian future of a unified humanity working in cooperation with alien species to form the United Federation of Planets. In this future, various people from ethnic groups had overcome their seemingly insurmountable differences. There was a Russian helmsman, a black woman who was a communication officer, a Japanese helmsman, and even an alien first mate. Gene Roddenberry intentionally wanted to ensure that folks of various backgrounds were represented on screen as officers on the Starship Enterprise. Having a black woman as an officer on the ship was revolutionary. Even so, Nichelle Nichols felt that she needed to leave the show. She was offered a role in a play that was set to go to Broadway. She had a musical theater background and wanted to pursue that. So she decided to dump Star Trek. She told Gene Roddenberry, and he asked her to give him the weekend. And if she still felt that she wanted to leave by Monday, he would accept her resignation. Well, that weekend, Nichelle Nichols went to an NAACP function as a celebrity guest. She was notified that a fan wanted to meet her at the function. She accepted, turned around to see the fan. It was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He professed his love for the show, how it was the only show he and Loretta Scott King would allow their children to stay up past their bedtime to watch. It was so important to him. When Miss Nichols told him that she was going to leave Star Trek at the end of the season, he told her she couldn't. According to Miss Nichols, Dr. King said, "For the first time on television, we will be seen as we should be seen every day. When we see you, we see ourselves, and we see ourselves as intelligent and beautiful and proud." He knew the power of people seeing Uhura on the show, being an astronaut. He said that it would help show the world that Black Americans could be astronauts, doctors, lawyers, anything they wanted to be. It was important not only for young Black children to see what they could be, but for white Americans and everyone else to see what Black people could be as well. Dr. King knew children are also affected by representation. He was right. Mae Jemison, the first Black woman astronaut, credits seeing Uhura on Star Trek as a big inspiration for her wanting to reach for the stars. Images show us possibilities. A lot of times, fantasy is what gets us through to reality. In fact, after the landmark blastoff of the Space Shuttle Endeavour in 1992 that made history, Mae Jemison called Nichelle Nichols to thank her for the inspiration. And during the mission, she broke with protocol to start her shift by saying, "Hailing frequencies open." That's just one of the coolest things I've ever heard. George Takei also discussed how important it was for so many folks in the Asian American community watching Sulu, an Asian character who was not a stereotype, not speaking with an accent, and being put in a leadership team of the Enterprise. It's something hard to explain to anyone who sees themselves represented in most media that they see. There are tons of characters, nuanced takes, heroes, villains, and most of the time, the color of their skin and the shape of their eyes doesn't really define who their characters are. And the sentiment appears to be pretty common. Viacom CBS ran a survey in 2021 worldwide to look into this issue. Only about half the people surveyed were satisfied with their representation in media. 79% said that there needs to be more diversity seen on the screens. And calls for diversity came from 80% of people who considered themselves to be underrepresented, and 90% of Black people. 84% agreed that companies making entertainment need to commit to more diversity and representation on screen.
Per Viacom's own study, perpetuating stereotypes and lazy portrayals of different groups are hugely damaging to audiences. Harmful stereotypes are especially apparent among certain ethnic groups, who feel that they are portrayed particularly negative ways. For example, Middle Eastern and Arabic people and Black people feel they are portrayed as criminals. Middle Eastern and Arabic people and indigenous people feel that they're portrayed as angry. Middle Eastern and Arabic people and black people feel that they are portrayed as dangerous. Nearly 60% of those who feel poorly represented say it makes them feel unimportant, ignored, or disappointed. Among those who feel poorly represented, the top 3 areas that a lack of representation impacts are self-esteem and confidence, sense of belonging, and opportunities.
So companies are seeing through their own research that audiences want more diversity globally, not just in racially or ethnically, but economically, religiously, and even dialect and accent-wise. I know I am talking about representation through the lens of race and ethnicity, but that's not the entire scope. Disability, sexual orientation, gender, economic status, religion. There are so many types of representation, and they're all part of it. Think about disabled characters in the media that you know. For the most part, it appears to me that they either have superpowers or they're defined solely by their disability. It's a showcase of their courage under adversity. Now, there's a term that some disability advocates use for it. More rare are the occurrences of characters showing an accurate representation of disability. There's a stigma to disability in our culture, and the very vocal group of folks who will actively fight you for trying to include disability in stories, especially genre fiction. If there was any doubt, check out the fervor over the wheelchair-accessible dungeon or the combat wheelchair in D&D. Think about the depictions of the poor in the media. The paper Media Images of the Poor tells us, quote, low-income persons are far more likely to be seen and heard on real-life programs such as afternoon talk shows, e.g. Ricky Lake or Jerry Springer, and reality-based crime programs, e.g. Cops, than as characters in fictional programs. Both types of programs, however, present the poor and working class in a distorted and negative manner. End quote. But as with so many things, the intersection of categories can exacerbate problems and compound upon each other. And the media can shape how we view the problem and the potential solution. For instance, that same paper also points out that the lack of exposure to news that contextualizes social issues or more nuanced news that goes in-depth can have an effect on the belief of the people who receive that news. White and black viewers are less likely to blame African Americans for their economic hardships when exposed to news that goes into the reason of why poverty happens. These opinions have a snowballing effect. The lack of nuance in news creates an easy cookie-cutter solution in the minds of the viewer. And then the viewer becomes more entrenched in that position the more that they're exposed to that news. Without the nuanced understanding of the issue, the viewer doesn't have a nuanced foundation to find a solution. Then the viewer converts to a voter, and the voter votes for things that don't actually solve the root problems. Thus, the media interpretation can facilitate the very evil that they're trying to shine a spotlight on for folks, as opposed to finding a solution. The study further discusses how the media created the image of the welfare queen, the single mom who spends their assistance checks on cigarettes, nail polish, and feeding Pepsi Cola to a baby. There's an element of race in that as well. In the 1990s, African Americans were showcased 67% of all stories about poverty, even though they make up only 29% of those in poverty. And the image of the welfare queen doesn't statistically exist. News media made it seem like the majority of those receiving welfare were exploiting the system somehow. This in turn created a push for welfare reform, where the measure of success was the decrease in the number of cases of folks on welfare as opposed to how many people were actually out of poverty, prompting the question, what was the goal of the social welfare program? Is it to not exist or to help people? The common statement is that we're past the age where representation matters. The paper cited previously about poverty and race was published in 2001, a little over 20 years ago. Uhura was on Star Trek in 1966. That's almost 60 years ago. It's important in the 60s. It was important 20 years ago, and considering that Fox News ran stories about how character was what elevated people from poverty, we can see that the message is still the same. Complete nuanced representation means just like people needed to see in 1966. We could be seen as we should be seen every day. Altering the narrative. So a friend of mine handed me a copy of the book House of Leaves sometime around 2007. She told me to read the book with an open mind as to what a novel could be. I took it home and was immediately enthralled. I couldn't put it down. I could, however, rotate it, reread passages, flip back 5 pages to see what I missed, and that's kind of because the book looks like this. This is a novel that has to be a novel. It utilizes the geometry of paper in a way that no other medium really could convey. This book could not be faithfully adapted into a movie. I would go so far as to say it should not be adapted into another medium. Now, that's just my opinion. It challenges me in a way that a movie really can't. Now, don't get me wrong, that's not a knock against movies. I've seen movies that challenge me in ways that are just as impactful as House of Leaves. I just mean that movies cannot challenge me in the way that House of Leaves challenged me. They're different mediums with different strengths and different weaknesses. Yeah, like the medium is the message? Well, I actually don't know Marshall McLuhan's theory. I've never studied communication theory, and unlike other YouTubers, I'm not going to presume something just because I've read a Wikipedia article on it. But it is interesting to me that things that make people angry about adaptations, the obvious examples of this is the changing of the skin color of the characters from the book to the film. Now, this is interesting to see various examples of this. Ursula K. Le Guin,
like a boss,
was disgusted with the adaptation of her Earthsea novels into the sci-fi miniseries in 2004. She spoke specifically about how the skin color of the main characters were changed. Ged, a character described as having reddish-brown skin tone, was played by a white actor. And the issues of race and gender that Le Guin explored in the novels were removed altogether. So the changes were made to the skin tone and the characters to whitewash them, a major plot and thematic changes were made. Le Guin disowned the project. Then you have very accurate adaptations with full approval from the author, like Stephen King's The Shining.
Here's Johnny.
Whoa, no, not that movie. That's the critically acclaimed landmark film The Shining, directed by Stanley Kubrick. King hated that movie and the deviations from his original text. I'm talking about 1997's Stephen King's The Shining.
Watch this.
It was a TV miniseries starring Steven Weber, you know, from Wings. I'm old. So because of his displeasure with the original adaptation of The Shining, Stephen King personally supervised this adaptation as a made-for-TV miniseries. Filmed in the hotel King was inspired by initially and very faithful to the source material, the miniseries was a commercial success, by miniseries standards. But who remembered it? It didn't plant itself into the social zeitgeist like the film did. I've never seen any analysis of the miniseries, or going into the minutiae or the meaning of it. That's because no one really cares about it, aside from Stephen King himself. Film is a different medium. It's a different genre, a different art form altogether. The book works and is beloved for what it is. The film, The Shining by Stanley Kubrick, works and is beloved for what it is. And that includes the changes that are made by the filmmakers. Changes have to be made from transferring a work to one medium from another. And I have some sympathy for those who talk about the changes to the plot or significant issues with the theme of the adaptation. Some of those can be what I consider successes. I love the movie Starship Troopers as a scathing critique of fascism, even though it took only a minuscule amount from the original book. It was a rebuttal of the book and the book's messaging. I don't know if it was just because it was 1997, apparently a good year for adaptations, and we were still using cans connected by strings to communicate, but I just don't remember folks getting all up in arms about it. The book is pretty fascist, even though Heinlein tried to defend the book by saying he was only talking about selective franchise, and you could gain enfranchisement through civil service, not just through the military. Quotes from the book seem to disagree with that interpretation.
Johnny, people get killed in the federal service.
Who gave you this idea?
Starship Troopers was also a movie with intentional whitewashing. Let's think about the last names of the characters in the book. Rico, Flores, Jimenez. He's also from Buenos Aires.
Let me tell you something. I'm from Buenos Aires, and I say kill them all! Yeah! Okay.
However, because it was a critique of fascism, specifically Nazi fascism, the decision was made to have all the main characters white. I mean, Casper Van Dien looks like he jumped out of a Nazi propaganda poster. All in a film directed by a guy who grew up in Nazi-occupied Holland. He has very specific feelings about fascism. But what gets to me sometimes is the pedantic way folks get upset about things that have no effect on the plot or themes of the story. It seems to nitpick the most innocuous detail that has changed and shines a light on it. I found a jarring juxtaposition of this online. Obviously, I'm leading into skin color here. It was a controversy when Idris Elba was cast as Heimdall. And the controversy wasn't that the role was too small for Idris Elba, because are you kidding me? This is Idris Elba. You're wasting Idris Elba. I want him to be cast in every role. If you film my biography, I want Idris Elba to play me. There was a controversy with The Witcher's casting as well, Lord of the Rings and Cowboy Bebop, and The Wheel of Time. To me, it seems like a weird thing to get a fuss over. I think the most common retort misses the point. How would you feel if white people were put into movies of Asian legend? As an Asian person, I get this a lot. It gets something out of the way first. It does happen. Matt Damon was in a movie about the Great Wall of China, and Marco Polo being the POV character for the Netflix TV show about the Mongolian Empire under Kublai Khan. Shogun by James Clavell with the POV characters John Blackthorne. We had that happen a lot because the Asian viewpoint is considered too foreign for American audiences to stomach. So they need a white character to act as a surrogate to teach them about these alien people. Now, that's not to say I agree with it all the time. Tokenism is a problem as well to consider. We're going to get back to that in a little bit. In the area of fantasy movies and TV shows, I have a little pet theory about this. I don't think that the inclusion of diverse casting is for POCs directly. To me, it feels like something they do for white audiences. It serves two purposes. First, is to make a racially conscious white audience member feel better about not watching a fantasy setting that keeps a homogeneously white cast of its folks. I think some white audiences watching a completely white fictional world may make them feel a little uneasy, like they're doing something they know they shouldn't be doing. The notion that they are purposefully excluding POC from this little fantasy, in both the literary and literal meaning of that word. It's something of a forbidden indulgence. So the entertainment industry folks sprinkle in a little color so this white audience can still maintain their white male protagonist and not feel like they're engaging in a tiny little bit of racism along the way. It's just a little guess that could be completely off base, especially because of something I'll say later. The other reason is to train white audiences to accept POC as a given in fantasy. It's a conscious attempt to break the mold of having the default white characters in the story. This is true more than in just casting situations. I've discussed how most of the video essayists I know are white on Twitter. I've even pointed out that there seems to be a divide in content creators. POC content creators constantly are trying to shout out each other, and they also love to fawn over the white content creators. White content creators have either two forms of shout out. One being specifically look at these POC, like during Black History Month or something, and the other being general recommendations of other content creators, all of whom just happen to be white. And what's frustrating is that many of these folks, most of whom talk a big game about anti-racism and all that, simply don't notice that they've just made an incredibly monochromatic recommendation. If you point that out, they blink, confused, and then come to the realization that their recommendations share a similar pigment of skin. That's something that this so-called forced diversity is trying to train white audiences to realize. POC folks always notice a POC in the media, and it gets more noticeable when you share the distinction. I've discussed with other mixed-race people that we can kind of see when a mixed-race character or actor shows up in media that we love instantly. The casting choice pushes them into the faces of the white audience. They don't notice when the cast is all white because in their minds that's the default. But the goal is to understand that diversity should be the default. I'm not feeling an overwhelming sense of representation when I see an Asian actor playing an elf in some movie. I don't reach out and feel, that's me, when I see a Hispanic actor in a sci-fi show. But white audiences gradually get more and more used to the idea of diversity being the default. And that, dear viewer, has benefits to us all. I see the comment already, because I can see into the future. Toilet paper is the currency of the new world. I'm all for proper representation of POC and whatnot, but blackwashing and colorblind casting is just reversing the same problem. You get POCs in roles that don't actually represent history or the authorial intent of the world they built.
That is one big pile of shit.
So, there's a couple of things to touch on here. First is the harm done. Whites are overwhelmingly represented in American media. The taking away of one role to add to the roles of POCs doesn't really even come close to bringing us to the level of equality or equity or proportionally correct numbers. So the harm to white actors is so minimal, it basically doesn't exist. It also brings about feelings of inclusion and joy to those so rarely able to see themselves in that form of media. Seeing people like me in periods that weren't historically accurate is kind of fun for me sometimes. Take, for instance, Jim Morita. Jim Morita is a comic book character that was a member of the Howling Commandos, a Japanese-American U.S. Army Ranger that fought in World War II with Captain America and Sergeant Fury before he became the head of S.H.I.E.L.D. You know, Nick Fury. The problem, Jim Morita was written into the comics in 1967. The first Japanese Army Ranger was Vincent Okamoto, who was inducted into the Army Rangers in 1967. There couldn't have been a Japanese American in the U.S. Army Rangers in 1945. It is ahistorical. But we let it go. Because it's fun to see an Asian American fight next to Nick Fury in Captain America. Did anyone cause a stink about this? Not that I know of. But if folks really cared about real history, shouldn't they have? If it was really about historical accuracy? But then we have the replacement. The comment that I see is, don't change history and make some a POC when they're not. Or, instead of making a POC character, make a new character who's a POC. Let's talk about those. Historical figures being black, to me, depends upon circumstances. Now, this is my opinion, and if it's something like saying Thomas Edison was Asian, I'm not really interested in that. Thomas Edison was a real person. If you want to tell his story, we can embellish and alter things, and I'd prefer that we cast someone who be reminiscent of the actual person. But I don't know if a movie would change the world's understanding of Thomas Edison being a white man in America. Casting an Asian as the person who invented the light bulb wouldn't cause me to lose sleep. And the main reason why this so-called double standard exists is because of the nature of power structures and the opportunity in films. As a white person considered the default in the average movie, they get the majority of roles. The only roles that they're excluded from are roles that are explicitly calling for a POC actor, due to either history or specific cultural ties. Even then, not always are POC cast. Look at the 2015 movie Aloha. Emma Stone plays Alyssa Eng. The character is of mixed Hawaiian and Chinese descent. Emma Stone is German, English, Scottish, and Irish. Scarlett Johansson played the Major in 2017's Ghost in the Shell, an explicitly Japanese role. 2018 saw Catherine Zeta-Jones, a Welsh actress, play the real-life Colombian drug lord Grisel Blanco.
Where's Alberto? He should be on his way to Medellin, no?
Now, you see how the power and opportunity balance veers greatly towards white actors. So the utilization of colorblind casting attempts to counteract that imbalance. Having said that, it isn't perfect. It's still putting POC in a white-centric story, which at best glosses over the possible racial issues that would have existed, and at worst pretends to showcase a world that never existed. And you also have a situation like in Hamilton, where a light-skinned Latino actor stares at a black actor playing a slave owner and lecturing said black man about the evils of slavery. I agree that more POC stories should be told. Casting POC in roles of white historical figures is an imperfect stepping stone towards equality. Notice that I said historical figures. When it comes to fiction, especially fiction where the skin color really doesn't factor into the story in this fictional world, I don't agree that there's a problem. I don't care if Achilles was black and Troy Fall of the City. Achilles was not a real person. I don't care if Catwoman is played by a mixed-race woman or a black woman. Selena Kyle isn't real! Her identity isn't tied to any culture or ethnic root. It's just window dressing to the character. I don't care if the author failed to introduce the character as a POC, or if the author made up a reason like the Roman relocation practice to explain the reason why various skin-tone folks lived in the same village. It's this fantasy. I feel no obligation to adhere to the author's possible inherent prejudice. If I wrote a story without any LGBTQIA+ individuals in it, and someone adapted to include that, I would probably see that as an improvement, even from a marketing side. Some kid out there sees themselves in the world because of it. They like it because of it. Groovy. More money for me. One more person buying the book. Should the adaptation of Lovecraft necessarily include Lovecraft's racism? This guy wrote a poem called The Creation of and while I censored that, I didn't even actually say it. I just did it as a joke because I can't bring myself to say that word. So if we wanted to adhere to authorial intent, would it really be Lovecraft without the racism? There's gonna be someone saying yes, but I think you can agree that if the author, especially an author from a bygone era, intentionally or unintentionally left in some sexism, homophobia, racism, or ableism in their work, then the artists adapting their work into a new medium have no obligation to adhere to that bigotry. Tolkien wasn't overtly racist. He actually, in his own way, tried to be anti-racist. He wasn't perfect, but I like giving participation trophies. Get it? 'Cause I'm a millennial. Ha! I made myself laugh with my own joke. But that doesn't mean we need to adhere to his implicit racism in Lord of the Rings, like the lack of good people, elves, or dwarves who aren't white. But, I hear you cry, Tolkien was making a mythology for England, was he? Because Arthurian legend already existed. And also, he never actually said that. He loved making languages, and made stories and a world for his languages. He even made a book of myths in that world. He never intended it to be a representation of England. He lamented that, in his view, there were no legends bound to the languages of England. What he did say about his stories is, quote, mythically, these tales are elf-centered, not bound much to the real world at all. What is centered in the real world is science. And believe it or not, there's a lot of science into this whole representation thing. The science of representation. So, none of that convinced you. You don't care how representation makes me feel or any other POC. You don't think that emotional response is anything other than some illusory or temporary mood change. The fact it brings someone a brief joy isn't enough for you to accept black elves. You don't care, and you don't notice all the white casts as usual. Maybe that is how your life is. All white folks with no POC anywhere, so seeing a POC is unrealistic to you. You are still standing there asking the question, why does any of this matter? So I got the comment after my bioessentialism video, which you can check out here, bueno, stating that it doesn't matter if something like D&D regurgitates racist tropes. It isn't real. It's not like media makes people racist. Well, about that. Entertainment does affect us. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a nuanced situation. Just because I'm discussing media's effect on people doesn't mean that I'm saying that video games cause murder. I am specifically discussing media representation's effect on people. People have been studying film's effects for years. In 1933, a study was done on the effect of these motion pictures on children from 6th grade to college-age adults and the perception of racial groups using a variety of videos, including Birth of a Nation, a notoriously racist pro-KKK film. The findings indicated that a considerable change in the opinion of racial groups happened after watching the film. Now, this study in and of itself doesn't prove anything. If anything, it's just one study that indicated the effect of a group after viewing. You could probably dismiss it by stating that it was a product of its time, or that the people had lack of exposure. Other things as well. If that was the only one. Sadly, the rabbit hole goes so much deeper than that, and the effects are much broader. Simply watching TV can have an effect. It enforces social norms. What you consider normal is often shaped by the media, and specifically public media. Media with broad dissemination is more effective than individual persuasion in changing the attitudes of the individual. When information is spread out and presented as the norm, it can dissuade or encourage behavior, even lowering violence towards women. That's how powerful this is. Mass media lowered violence towards women by communicating that it was not socially acceptable to do so. Media steered society. Quote, the current research in psychology pertaining to media and racism provides a broad base of evidence that media portrayals of stereotyping can result in several harmful outcomes. If there is something to be noticed here, we believe that it may be an unfortunate underestimation of the strength and prevalence of media's role in the formation and maintenance of racial stereotypes, even among those of us who like to believe that our attitudes are progressive or egalitarian, because we are all vulnerable. Although perhaps not as cognizant of our vulnerability, research on the effect of the media on stereotyping and strategies we may employ to diminish such harmful outcomes is particularly urgent. End quote. And what may be somewhat counterintuitive to some of our more right-leaning viewers, the entirety of the media, not just one or two specific sources, tends to push people into more moderate or conservative views. This is not some conspiracy theory. Rather, it's an outcome of the nature of media itself. See, media emerges from the society that it creates. As such, A society reinforces its values and views through the media. As moderates and conservatives generally want to preserve the nature of things, that is by definition what conservatives are trying to conserve, it benefits those mindsets. So the media tends to reinforce those norms. This television viewing can have an accumulated effect over time. TV has a power of accumulation by the nature of how it's delivered. That can lead to very bad outcomes for certain groups in multiple ways if their representation is negative. Negative TV news stories consistently showcase Black Americans as poor or criminals, led to more viewers having negative views of Black people in general. It also led to harsher views of welfare recipients. However, television dramas, which even by the 90s had started to push towards more positive representation, actually had the opposite effect. Not only did white subjects in the study have more positive character attributes to Black people, but also believed them to be generally higher in socioeconomic status. We live in an age where we should be able to have grown out of the idea that TV news has no effect. William Randolph Hearst used a newspaper to try to manipulate the United States into a war with Spain in 1898. Now, historians dispute the effect of biased yellow journalism outside of New York, but the New York Journal had a circulation of over 1 million readers. That's 1 in 12 households in America subscribing to the paper at this time. And the United States didn't actively participate in various other Spanish wars of independence throughout Latin America previous to this. Biased news is not new! Native Americans have had consistent terrible representation, and while we've seen how representation has had a negative effect on people's perception of the group from the outside, it can also affect the community in question. It lowers the community's sense of its own self-worth and self-esteem of the individuals inside of the community and leads to the individuals in the community feeling trapped, unable to achieve anything meaningful. As I mentioned before, it isn't just ethnic or racial groups. The same thing happens to other groups as well. At the time of writing this, the state of Florida in the United States enacted a law to prohibit the discussions of sexual orientation or gender identities in schools under the 3rd grade. 25 years ago, studies already showed that silencing any type of discussion of positive role models, messages, or images of LGBTQIA+ folks in schools was already pervasive and causing real damage to those students.
If this is signed, what about isolated or bullied children? Who will they be able to turn to at school?
But that's somewhat of a different point, isn't it? We aren't talking about some negative stereotyping of a group. Like it's something like Lord of the Rings or fantasy work. It isn't like we're making negative caricatures of people of color. They simply don't exist in those works. So perhaps if you can understand how repeated negative representations of a certain ethnic or racial group can cause harm, propaganda is a thing that exists in the world. But not having marginalized folks in something isn't the same thing. How can something hurt you if it simply isn't there? The psychology of invisibility. Erasure is something that most white Americans have never had to deal with. At worst, there is a change here or there in the character in fiction or history or in a movie somewhere that switched from being white to being a POC. However, it's undeniable that the vast majority of representation in the US in the media is of white Americans. From 1996 through 2005, American television characters have been anywhere from 79.5% to 83.3% white. Then there isn't a trend up or down with that. It just kind of wiggles around between those percentages without much change. So even if Anne Boleyn or Achilles is a POC in a movie or a TV show, no significant changes are made. Black Americans make up from anywhere from 16 to 12.4% in a somewhat downward trend in recent times. Latin actors have 1 to 3% of all roles. Asian Americans have 1 to 2.3%, and Native Americans went from 0 to 0.4%. While the black representation is actually coming close to the percentage of black Americans in this country, all other percentages are greatly outpaced by the actual demographics. The most egregious percentage is Latin actors. Hispanic demographics outpace the roles offered to them by, and this is the most generous number, 6 times. Again, this is true for various categories of people, not just ethnicity or race. These can be categories of gender, age, employment, religion, and sexuality. All of these categories are associated with, sometimes without any consent or action by the individual, social representations, and there are conflicting representations, both the ones we place on ourselves and the ones that others place on us. These identities have real-world consequences in everyday experiences and interactions. Lack of representation means the prevalence of existing stereotypes increase. This manifests in every interaction that a POC has to contend with. This is something that is subtle and usually happens instinctually. Non-POCs don't even think about it as they don't necessarily have to deal with it. But every interaction that a POC has done with the understanding that there is a stereotype they have to fight simply because they exist. The classic example of this is the black man in the elevator with the white woman. He avoids eye contact, has a gentle smile, maybe hums a children's rhyme in an effort to lower the white woman's defensiveness. It doesn't matter if he's had a bad day, he's cranky, he's exhausted. He feels the need to make the extra effort because his life may depend on it. And even if you disagree with that his life would be in danger, perhaps you don't think that all cops are bad. Yeah, we'll use that. The stereotype of police and their interactions with black men can also have an effect on this situation. Freiberg and Townsend state in their paper, quote, lacking adequate representation, minority group members must contend with the limited content and meaning that these images provide, relative invisibility. Given the small quantity of social representations for a minority group, as in the case of the media, the available representations become even more powerful because they may be the only representations which some members of society are exposed. End quote. The absence of this social representation causes feelings of being an outsider and the lack of inclusion. When I say inclusion, it's not just in the media, but also the groups enjoying the media. Social representations help an individual identify potential roles or ways of being in a specific context. Social representation provides information about who belongs and who doesn't, and who's successful and who isn't. So even in situations of fictional media like fantasy stories, if you don't include POCs, then you are sending a message that they are not supposed to be a part of this group. Quote, a social representation's perspective expands the stereotype threat focus beyond the detrimental effects of negative group representation to consider the detrimental effects of the absence of positive or any social representation on task performance. When no social representations or no positive representations of a group exists in a domain, frustration and failure in this context may be more significant, troubling, and consequential. The invisibility signals to the individual that he or she may not belong and may not be able or perhaps should not attempt to further in this domain. Furthermore, the situation is exacerbated by the absence of strategies that might enable the individual to contend with the challenges. In these cases, we're talking about fictional stories. The Witcher and The Lord of the Rings comes from a specific tradition, but they're not comparable to something like the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. While the Chinese epic is a fantastical tale, it is based in the culture and history of China. It's literally set in China. The Lord of the Rings, as we discussed, is not. The Witcher, while based on myths of Poland, is not set in Poland. However, there's a huge caveat to this. Researchers refer to this sometimes as solo status. You probably know it as Tolkienism. I'm sorry? What was that? Oh, it's tokenism! That makes more sense. Tokenism can have a variety of negative effects on the tokenized group. The simple inclusion of a solo or token person can actually accentuate the ideas of outsider and give negative stereotypes and enhance those stereotypes. It heightens the awareness of the differences and perceptions, and tokenism is more harmful for the more invisible the group. We can see this transition in Hollywood with the idea of the token minority, who is usually an exaggeration of stereotypes to begin with. Counter that with something like Star Trek, which showed a positive representation of each of the various ethnic groups that defied the stereotypes of the day. This counters the idea of gradual inclusion. You don't transition from invisible to tokenism to inclusion. Rather, full inclusion and a proper representation negates the effects of tokenism when it rears its ugly head. In fact, tokenism is an interesting concept. For me, they don't feed into the stereotypes of the real world. They're simply included as people in the worlds that they exist in. Watching something like The Witcher or Wheel of Time, it appears that the characters have different skin colors, and it doesn't much matter or make a difference in the narrative. And in many cases, there's so much of it done that it tries to counteract the idea that it's just one person in the entire realm looking like that. It's also kind of an odd situation because on one hand, it doesn't provide any sort of accurate representation, but it's also a fictional world, and accurate representation of our world is not really necessary or the point. What is different about modern inclusion is that these characters aren't coming from a bastardized version of real-world people. Generally, the original intent was without consideration of who would be in the cast of these roles of these characters and adaptations. But the inclusivity sends a message to the viewer, and seeing a POC in a world like this is normal. And to be honest, that by itself is a goal of a lot of inclusive media. Conclusion. Being an outsider in your own home is a weird experience. I've lived in the United States my whole life, and it does feel like something is happening in the media. Seeing Encanto or Turning Red come out back to back, Black Panther making over $1 billion, and POC included in my favorite media is really meaningful to me. Look, I'm not sitting here saying that it's all sunshine and rainbows. POC inclusion is a mix of good intentions and the attempt to exploit race to get my money. It can be both at the same time. I know that it is too easy for situations like Rings of Power to turn into some pandering tokenism. And to be clear, the inclusion of POC doesn't mean it's going to be a good show. But it does mean that it's more likely that I'm gonna watch that show. And it means that my kids will see more POC in fantasy shows. And their friends will too. And some of those characters may look like them, or may look like their friends. And maybe, just maybe, seeing all of them included on the screen will help a little bit more with the accepting of others who want to play too. The imagination making swords of sticks and trees into dragons. Thanks so much for watching. If you like what you saw here, please subscribe, like the video, and share it around. This is how the channel spreads, is because of the enthusiasm of you all, the viewers, in sharing it with your friends.